Well, good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. North America and all the ships at sea. This is Main Street, and we are without two important parts to our show today. One is your host, Gary Allen, who is still recovering from some ouchies. So I'll be your host for the next couple of weeks till the end of the month. I'm Geoffrey Mark. This is Main Street. Here's the other problem. Our guest, Ruta Lee, seems to be having some technical issues to come into the studio. Well, goodness gracious, Geoffrey Mark, what are you going to do? Well, seeing as how I've been in show business for 48 years and seeing as how I've had guests not show up before, and by the way, Ruta is a total pro. If she's not here, it's because she cannot get through. She would never, ever keep anybody waiting or hung up. So this is what I'm going to do. Turns out today is October 15th, 2021. That's when we're doing this show live. You might see it a little bit later when it's archived. But live today, it is the 70th anniversary of the first episode of I Love Lucy being aired. So if Ruta does not show up for whatever reason, and we love her and hope all is well, you're going to hear some really cool inside stuff about the making of I Love Lucy. If she gets to show up, I'll stop whatever I'm saying and bring Ruta in, and we'll have the wonderful conversation we had planned. So here we are. Let's talk about everything you always wanted to know about how I Love Lucy got started. And unless you've read my book, The Lucy Book, probably didn't know. Lucille Ball was approaching 40 years old when CBS came to her and said, Miss Ball, you have this hit radio series called My Favorite Husband, and we would love to bring it to television the same way we're bringing the George Burns and Gracie Allen show to TV, and the Goldbergs to TV, and the Jack Benny program to TV. And Lucille Ball said, I'm not really interested. She was busy making films. She was making a very nice dollar doing that. She was a highly paid radio artist. She had toured in shows. She didn't really want or need to do television. But Lucille Ball was anchored in Los Angeles. All her work was there. Desi Arnaz, her much-loved husband, was touring with his big band. They figured out that in 11 years of marriage, they'd actually spent about 6 months together. So she said to CBS, I'll bring My Favorite Husband to television if you let Desi Arnaz be the male lead, play my husband. And CBS said, absolutely not. A Cuban and a white girl married? We can't do that. That is an interracial mixed marriage. Disheartening that that's how people felt back then. Miss Ball and Mr. Arnaz pulled their resources together and with the help of some friends put together a vaudeville act, an act that would go on in between showings of a film in big theaters. Desi would sing and play the conga. They would do some sketches and sing together. The audiences loved them together. CBS could no longer say, yeah, he's no good. They acquiesced. Yes, audiences will accept you as a couple. So they put together a pilot program. They decided they would not bring My Favorite Husband as it was to television, but they would do a show like it. On My Favorite Husband, Lucille played Liz, the wife of a bank executive, and the older couple were Mr. and Mrs. Atterbury, his boss, and his unfulfilled boss's wife. That was the show. Gail Gordon and Bea Benaderet played the older couple. Richard Denning played the put-upon husband with Liz's antics. The show was produced by Jess Oppenheimer and written by Jess, along with Madeline Pugh, Martin Davis, and Bob Carroll Jr. So they renamed the thing I Love Lucy. It was Jess who created the concept. They'd be Ricky and Lucy Ricardo. He'd be what he was, an orchestra leader, only not nearly as famous or successful. There would eventually be an older couple, but we're not there yet. They put together a pilot program. closed circuit at CBS in Hollywood just to see what it would look like, done in front of a live audience. And it was wonderful. They filmed off of a monitor. It's called a kinescope. They shot a camera at a monitor because there was no coast to coast transmission, no digital anything. There wasn't even videotape yet. The show sold almost immediately to the Philip Morris Company, who made cigarettes along with a lot of other things these days. And then Mr. Arnaz had two things happen in his life. First, their daughter Lucy was born on July 17th of 1951, and he got a call from the people at Philip Morris. When are you guys moving to New York to do the show? And he said, what do you mean moving to New York? The purpose of the show was to keep them at home in their ranchita in Chatsworth, California, and to be together with their child and their mothers and their friends. Desi said, why can't we do it live here? He said, because there is no communication from coast to coast. You couldn't air a program. The technology was so new back then. And they said, we don't want a kinescope on the East Coast. We have more cigarette smokers east of the Mississippi than west, and a whole lot more television stations. Again, that's how new television was. And Desi said, well, what if we film it? And they said, no good. Both you and Miss Ball come alive in front of an audience. For this kind of comedy, just like for her radio show, you guys need the audience right there to do what audiences do, which is to give you energy and help you time the laughs. Desi was running out of options, and he said, all right, what if we filmed it in front of a live audience? And the people said, well, if you can do that, just fine. And Desi agreed to it and hung up the phone and went, oh gosh, now what do I do? Well, what he did was he contacted the producer, Jess Oppenheimer, told him what had happened, and Jess, with Desi's help, put together a crew of 100 of some of the most talented people in Hollywood, people who were Oscar winners, people who were the best radio had to offer, the best movies had to offer, and in some cases, the best Broadway had to offer, and put together I Love Lucy. They knew that their date, October 15th, was coming, but they didn't have Fred Mertz yet, and they didn't have Ethel Mertz yet. There were several older men who were considered for Fred Mertz, but the one we know had to reach out himself. He called Desi and said, hi, I'm William Frawley. How come you haven't considered me for this part? Let's have lunch. And Desi and Bill Frawley went to Nickadel's, which is a restaurant in the heart of Hollywood. And Bill said to him, hey, what do these other guys have that I don't have that you're considering them? And Desi said, it's not what they have that you don't have. It's what you do that they don't do. Bill Frawley was unfortunately an out-of-control alcoholic by this point in his life. He didn't look well. He looked much older than he was. And they came to an agreement. Bill Frawley, the very first time he showed up drunk, would be written out of that episode. The second time he showed up drunk, he'd be blackballed in Hollywood. And Bill agreed to that. Bill came back with his own set of demands. If I never show up drunk and make you happy, I want first-class transportation, lodging, and tickets if the Yankees are ever in the World Series while the show is on the air. And Desi agreed to that. And it cost Desi a lot of money because the Yankees were in the World Series every year. I Love Lucy was on the air. Well, they had their Fred Mertz, but what about Ethel? Tick-tock, tick-tock. They were getting very close to the first week's run for the very first episode. First episode filmed, by the way, because that wasn't the first one aired. There was an actress known to director Mark Daniels, who was the first season director of I Love Lucy. She had been Ethel Merman's understudy in 2 Broadway musicals and had become her own star in Cole Porter musicals on Broadway until she had a nervous breakdown. The woman was just getting back on her feet. And Mark knew she was appearing in La Jolla, California, right outside of San Diego, in one of the plays that she'd done on Broadway, The Voice of the Turtle. And Mark Daniels took Jess Oppenheimer and Desi Arnaz to see her. And Desi signed her up during the intermission. No audition and no meeting Lucille in advance. Well, here's where myth and reality sort of come together. Bill Frawley is there right at the first rehearsal day. He's the first one there. He wants to show how reliable he is. And everybody else involved with the show shows up. And then Vivian Vance shows up. And she goes over to kiss Desi, and she looks over at Bill Frawley. She didn't really recognize him. And she said, "Hey, Desi, who's the old coot?" And Desi, a little embarrassed, said, "Honey, that's the guy who's going to play your husband." And she said, "Husband? He can play my grandfather." William Frawley hated her the rest of his life, never forgave her for that one sentence. And it made their interactions personally difficult, but it made the interactions between Fred and Ethel perfect. The writers realized what they had in the antipathy between the two actors and wrote it into the scripts. Just like as they found out during the run that Bill Frawley was an ex-vaudevillian who could sing and dance, that Vivian Vance was a Broadway musical star who could sing and dance, and wrote that into the shows as well. That's the first run through of I Love Lucy. That episode, Lucy Thinks Ricky is Trying to Murder Her, was held back for a few weeks. They had some editing problems. The first episode actually shown is The Girls Want to Go to a Nightclub. You remember that one. It's Fred and Ethel's anniversary, and the girls want to go to a nightclub, and the boys want to go to a boxing match. I know it doesn't sound like much when I say it, but it was very, very, very funny. It's hard to imagine in those days. The first season, they had a Monday through Friday calendar. The cast and crew would get together at 10 o'clock on a Monday morning, and that Friday at dinner time, they produced that show in front of a live audience. They only had those 5 days for costume fittings, to learn their lines, to learn their blocking, to learn songs and dances, to figure out how to make the script as funny as possible or fix the script if it was necessary. In the second year and from thereafter, it was a 4-day schedule. So can you imagine having such little time to memorize Vitameter Vegemin or do the grape stomping or the chocolate factory or any of the wonderful episodes I Love Lucy had to offer? It was done so quickly. There was no time for fooling around. This wasn't long lunches. This wasn't a martini at lunch. This wasn't practical jokes. This was show up and get the work done. The show debuted, and within weeks, it was my top 5. And it took a little bit longer before it became the number 1. As someone said to me earlier today, I Love Lucy and the Texaco Star Theater were really the first appointment television where people built their evenings and their weeks to see Lucy on Monday and Uncle Milty on Tuesday. And of course, the kids all wanted to see Howdy Doody in the afternoon. So I Love Lucy was indeed the first situation comedy filmed in front of a live audience at a movie studio. There had been other things done, game shows, kind of sort of done that way, kind of sort of, but they were very stagnant. They weren't shot in a movie studio. They were shot in a theater, and it's one set. There's no changing costumes and changing sets and scenery, and it's very static, much, much easier. They had to bring in from, and I'm very close to my heart, Max Factor. The Max Factor building is now the Hollywood Museum. I'm a big part of that. And in fact, things from my life are in that museum. I'm very proud. But they sent Hal King out, and Hal had a hard job. 40-year-old Lucille Ball had to look 28 or 29. Desi Arnaz, as handsome as he was, had acne scars around his jawline that they had to cover up. Vivian Vance was only 2 years older than Lucille Ball. They had to do her makeup so that she could be seen under the very hot lights television needed back then, but not to look glamorous or young, because Vivian Vance had been known as a seductress on Broadway, as the other woman who, made men go weak. She was hardly a frump. And to make William Frawley look like he was actually alive and actually healthy enough to do all the things he did on the show. Because unfortunately, cigarette smoking and alcoholism had made him, let's put it this way, I am around the age Bill Frawley was when he started playing Fred Mertz. And he looks a whole generation older than I do. It's not because I'm so wonderful. It's because he didn't take good care of himself. And off they went, week after week after week, doing this show. Then they began to film the commercials for Philip Morris and realized we have the cameras, we have the sets, we have the time, that they could film other things besides that. And that's where Desilu Productions really starts. The name Desilu came from the boat they owned, because Desi loved to go fishing on his boat. It was called the Desilu, combination of their first names. So they came up with Desilu Productions and eventually the Desilu Studio. But we're getting ahead of ourselves on this story. By the way, in case you're just joining us, this is indeed Main Street. I am Geoffrey Mark, filling in for Gary Allen, who is feeling better, and we send him love. And we're talking about I Love Lucy because, unfortunately, our guest today is having technical problems. This is what happens once in a while when you're doing live television electronically from everybody's home. If one person's stuff fails, you're stuck. In fact, it almost happened to me about an hour ago. All the electricity in my house went out. And I was like, oh my gosh, what do I do? I won't be able to do the show that way. Well, happily, my electricity came on. Perhaps hers didn't. At any rate, we're talking about the 70th anniversary of I Love Lucy's first broadcast, which is indeed today. Hey, you might be asking, Geoffrey Mark, how do you know so much about all of this? Well, let me tell you that I am the proud author of the Lucy book, which was a compendium of every time Lucille Ball was on television, from early live TV through all of her own series, all through the years, her specials, game shows, talk shows, variety shows, commercials, everything was in it. The new Lucy book is coming out next year in time for the 60th anniversary of the Lucy Show. And it will include all of that, plus upgraded material, her films, her radio shows, her stage shows, and new interviews with people like Carol Burnett and Anne Margaret. You're going to love it. I hope you love it as much as you loved the first book. Anyway, we're talking about the first season of I Love Lucy. It was very, very, very hard. TJ Simpsons says, I like your hat. I'm glad you're watching. I'm glad that you're here. Thank you. It was very hard on Miss Ball. She had an awful lot of dialogue to learn, an awful lot of physical comedy to master in a very short period of time. There had been precious little time in between her having Lucy Arnaz and getting into the show. Yes, Eric Sean, we are hearing a story about the 70th anniversary of I Love Lucy. I'm talking to the people who are chatting. If you're watching and you want to make a comment, I will be happy to talk with you and tell you what's going on. So in the comments section, you can't wear hats like that. It's a talent, TJ. It's a special talent to wear hats like this. I have friends, all they have to do in the morning is put some water in their hair and put on a tight t-shirt. I have to work at it. And some of these days, I'll tell you why I always wear sequins. It was somebody else's idea. In fact, it was the idea of Rip Taylor, that he thought I was a good performer, but I dressed like an accountant. And since I dress like this, I have become a star. So thank you, Rip. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And TJ, that's why I dress like this. As the first season of I Love Lucy rolled around, Miss Ball actually had to spend some weekends in the hospital because she was completely physically exhausted. Desi Arnaz had been made executive producer 2/3 of the way through the first season. So he had extra responsibilities. And Lucille Ball became pregnant again. Oh no, what do we do now? If you watch carefully the first season of I Love Lucy, Lucy and Ricky sleep in basically what is a California king bed. 2 single beds, but they're put together as one bed. There's no doubt about it. This is a husband and wife sleeping together. They decided, through the good, swift thinking of producer Jess Oppenheimer, that they could get so many stories out of this that they included the pregnancy in the show, because otherwise what they were left with would be filming her from here to here, filming her behind big chairs, filming her behind balloons, hiding it. And they said, no, let's be honest and let's let Lucy and Ricky have a baby. Well, you would have thought that Jess was saying, let's have Lucy and Ricky naked, at the response they got from the network and from the sponsor. Here's the problem in 1952 television. If somebody is pregnant, it means they had sex. We can't have that on television. Nobody has sex on television. Babies come by the stork. That's how our culture was back then. So to please CBS and Philip Morris, Jess and the Arnazes brought in a priest, a minister, and a rabbi to read every script, to vet everything that was written, that nothing should be offensive to anybody. And the clergy people said, what could be offensive about having a baby? It's God's will. It's a natural human thing. It's a joy. It's a blessing. The only thing they had to change was they could not use the word pregnant, because to impregnate someone one more time, it means they were getting chummy, and you can't have that on television. So they came up with infanticipating and mother to be and expecting, those kinds of euphemisms. Somehow that's what worked, and it worked really well. The second season, Mark Daniels bowed out. It was too much work. It was too hard, and it didn't pay enough. And they brought in my friend William Asher. Bill Asher had been doing some live TV. He'd been doing some stage work, and he'd been doing some small film work. He was perfect. He was the perfect director for Lucille Ball. Once Bill came in, and once Miss Ball learned to trust him, they didn't just rehearse at the studio. They rehearsed in the evenings, so that Lucille Ball felt free enough to try things that maybe didn't work, or they worked, but they had to be better. And this gave her the freedom to do this. Yes, folks, you are hearing a story. I'm glad you like my hats. Thank you. Thank you. I love hearing from you guys. Bill gave her the freedom to be really, really excellent. And it gave them the freedom, because Bill was very good at staging musical numbers, to do that and to do it well. So that it was another layer of real excellence brought to the show. It also did something. It invented something. Now, they've already invented all these things to make I Love Lucy happen. Now they're going to invent something, not on purpose, but it turned out to be half of what television is. There wasn't enough time to film enough episodes of Lucille Ball being pregnant before she actually had the baby and had to take time off. No matter how fast they pulled her through it, she couldn't do it. So they decided to fill in time. They would film some new opening segments with Vivian Vance, Bill Frawley, and Desi that would lead into, oh, remember when? Flashbacks. And then basically they would just start an old episode. And today we call that a rerun. Someone was asking me earlier today, I'm doing a lot of live television today, how brilliant it was that they invented the rerun. No one was inventing a rerun. They were inventing a way to stay on the air. it just worked out that once they saw that the American public watched the rerun episode as much as they watched the new ones, like, ooh, we've got something here. And that brought us into the modern rerun. They didn't know people would be watching I Love Lucy for the rest of their lives, their children's lives, and their grandchildren's lives, and their great grandchildren's lives. Because my little ones, my grandchildren watch I Love Lucy. They know nothing else of classic TV, but they know Lucy. Well, I'm their grandfather. Of course, they know Lucy. I'd like to think, though, it's because the show is so wonderful. So the second season goes on. It's a long season. It takes them almost a year to film that season because they sort of didn't take a summer break. They almost immediately began filming new episodes, but they had to take quite a long break when she was getting too pregnant to work and then when she had the baby. So they started off in their first apartment with their original furniture. They get a new living room set. They have the baby. They move to a new apartment. They get another new living room set. They get another new living room set. And there you are. And you'd think these wonderful people would rest on their laurels. Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz went immediately from filming the second season of I Love Lucy into making the film The Long, Long Trailer. And this hour is not about the long, long trailer, except it was a major MGM comedy. It was directed by wonderful Vincent Minnelli. It's a wonderful film. They wrapped it up. They had a short vacation, and we're coming back for the third season of I Love Lucy. And then, dun, 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 something happened. What happened was the communist witch hunt. Lucille Ball never really knew her father. And I don't talk much about her private life, except this does affect how the show was made. So the father in her life was her mother's father, her maternal grandfather, Fred Hunt. He was like daddy, and she loved him dearly. And he was a character. He was very active in politics. I don't know if he was an actual communist, a socialist, a democratic socialist. The words keep changing their meaning. But he asked his children and grandchildren, would they please register as communists? In the 1930s, during the Depression, when everybody was out of work and hungry and worried, being a socialist, being a communist, it didn't carry any real meaning other than another political party. And there were other political parties back then. It wasn't just only Democrats and Republicans. Nobody thought twice about it. No one will ever know how Miss Ball actually voted, but I would be enormously surprised if she actually followed through. I'm sure she voted her conscience, whatever that was. Certainly Desi, who was kicked out of his native Cuba during a revolution, would not be a communist. The whole thing was laughable. Miss Ball was brought in front of the committee in closed session. No reporters, no television cameras, no harassment. They asked her to explain. She explained. They accepted it. And as far as the Arnazes were concerned, it was over. Yeah, except sometimes journalists are pigs. And since he's gone, I'll call him a pig. Walter Winchell was a major columnist of those days in newspapers, on radio, and on television by this point. And I guess he needed a ratings boost, or he sought in some way to ingratiate himself to the conservative press. And he outed Lucille Ball for having done this. He knew already that she had been exonerated. He knew this, but he didn't say this. He just said, oh, communist, like it was a news flash that he had figured out. Well, that put the cast and crew of I Love Lucy, CBS Television, Bill Paley, the president, and Philip Morris and the Biao agency who did their commercials into a tailspin. What do we do? Are we going to lose the show now? Is Lucille Ball going to become unable to work in show business? Well, the episode they were doing was the one, remember the one where Lucy and Ethel buy a dress shop? That's the episode they were doing. Through gritted teeth and nerves of steel, they rehearsed and indeed filmed the episode. Only then did Miss Ball collapse. And the next day, Walter Winchell vindicated her as if he and he alone had found out that she was actually innocent. Caused everybody, as they would say in my hometown of Brooklyn, agita, heartburn. Really, everybody involved lost a week of sleepless nights over nothing. But you know what? It didn't affect the show at all. People loved the Lucy character so much that despite the fever in this country to get rid of communists in show business and everywhere else, the show not only survived, it thrived. By this point, I Love Lucy was now being sold all over the world. It was now being shown in Canada. Hey, piece of trivia. You know how the show opens, how you've always watched it with that heart, da 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 da. That's not how the show opened. The show always opened with cartoon characters of Lucy and Ricky promoting the sponsor's product. That heart thing we all watch came about because the sponsors in Canada were different than the sponsors in America. And the sponsors all over the world would be different. So they came up with a generic opening that anyone who sponsored the show could run and then say, brought to you by whoever was actually sponsoring the show. That's what stuck. It was those prints that got rerun over and over and over all those years. And now I'd like to remember what it was I was starting to talk about before I told you about how the show opened. Well, it was being shown all over the world. So the I Love Lucy phenomenon wasn't just in this country, it was everywhere. Everywhere people had television, which was not a whole lot back then. A lot of countries were just starting to get it. But the phenomenon kept going. Lucy remained number one. And by the way, I say Lucy, I mean the show or the character. I always refer to the woman as Miss Ball. I only got to meet her once. I was lucky enough to get to interview her. But I don't want anyone to think that I was friends with Lucille Ball. My good buddy Michael Stern, who was her official number one fan, he was friends with Lucille Ball. I got to know her by doing decades of research, interviewing hundreds of people, and having the pleasure of interviewing her once. For the purposes of the book, however, I interviewed the directors, the writers, the camera people, the makeup people, the hairstylists, the clothes designers, and all of the character actors and guest stars through the years. I Love Lucy did not start off as being a show that had a weekly guest star showed up. It happened in the first season when they brought in B. Benaderet and Edward Everett Horton for one episode. It really started the guest star thing when they decided the show needed a little boost. They had beginning to run out of ideas for these characters. And they decided that Ricky was going to make a movie. Well, bringing the locale of the show to Hollywood meant anybody was available. And a lot of huge stars, many of whom had already been in films with Lucille Ball or had been in nightclubs with Desi Arnaz, happily came on. John Wayne, so many, William Holden, Van Johnson. They loved her. They loved working with her. They loved being on the number one show on television. They knew how well written the show was. They knew that if they appeared, they would be well protected, well written for. They'd look great. They'd sound great. And even if their personal performance wasn't their best work, they knew the whole world would be watching it. It was wonderful cross promotion for their films or albums or nightclub appearances. So everybody wanted to do it. And Jess Oppenheimer and the Arnazes took great good care of everybody who came on that show. Some of them were a little scared. Some of them were not used to how they worked, how intense the work was, how fast the work was. I'm going to save a story for my next book, but there's a wonderful story about Bill Holden that will be in the book, but I cannot tell it to you here. It's a little naughty, and we're a family show here. But look for that in the new Lucy book, the story about Bill Holden and Lucille Ball on I Love Lucy. They again decided to bring the show on the road. We'll get to Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, Gary, because they were not on I Love Lucy. They were on Here's Lucy. So don't get ahead of me here. That's Gary, our host, who is feeling better and will be on with you in early November. They decided to take the show to Europe. And it was a good thing and it was a bad thing. It was a sad thing because Jess Oppenheimer was a genius, a child genius, a child prodigy, and really, really was an integral part of the success of I Love Lucy. Desi Arnaz was a genius at business, a genius as a showman, and a surprisingly wonderful comedy actor. Well, these two geniuses both wanted to take bows for the show. And they both had good points. Jess did indeed create it. He was the producer. He was the head writer. But it was Desi's money that paid for it, in that the production company was Desi's. The cameras belonged to Desi. The sets belonged to Desi. And Lucille Ball belonged to Desi, as well as his own performing. And it just did not seem like they could make for a happy continued marriage, Jess and Desi. So at the end of the 5th season, Jess Oppenheimer had left the show. And there's a change. You notice a change in the writing of the show. It didn't become worse. It just became different. The characters' voices became different because Jess used to take all of the scripts that were written and then rewrite them in his own voice so that from episode to episode, they sounded alike and the characters were true to themselves, that writers didn't throw something in that wasn't really good character just to get a laugh. Now, they did get 2 extra writers in that 5th season. They got my friend Bob Schiller and his partner Bob Weisskopf. Again, 2 brilliant, brilliant comedy writers who went on to write for Red Skelton and All in the Family and Maude. They had nice, long, wonderful careers. Wonderful men. Lucille Ball really surrounded herself, whether she did it or Desi did it or Jess did it, with brilliant, brilliant practitioners of whichever art was being involved. The best writers for I Love Lucy, not necessarily for the Lucy Show and Here's Lucy. The best directors, not necessarily for the Lucy Show and Here's Lucy. But we're talking about I Love Lucy and its 70th anniversary. The last season, little Ricky is suddenly 5 years old and a talking member of the cast. It's decided that Ricky needs to be more successful. He buys the Tropicana, the club he's always been playing in, and calls it the Club Babalu. They move from New York to Westport, Connecticut, and buy a very large early American home. They get new neighbors, Ralph and Betty Ramsey, played by Mary Jane Croft and Frank Nelson. The show, as it was, could have steamrollered on, except the Arnazes were getting tired. It was very hard as Desilu Productions grew, and they were producing not just their own show, but Make Room for Daddy and Our Miss Brooks and December Bride. How many hours are there in a day for Desi to play Ricky and also do running the studio? How many hours in a day can Lucille Ball play Lucy Ricardo and be the vice president of the studio and be a mother to 2 young children? So it was decided at the end of the 6th season, they would wrap it up. There was no end, because they knew there'd be more. For the next 3 seasons, Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz did hour-long versions of the I Love Lucy format. More guest stars, bigger production values, but without having the cast there week after week, without having Jess Oppenheimer, and Bob and Madeline left for a year and a half and then came back as script supervisors, the show seemed a little stuffy. It seemed a little overproduced and underfunny. And then the last season and a half, they stopped having live audiences because Desi couldn't be there. So they had to film things in pieces to make it happen. It wasn't the best work for the Arnazes. See, the people at Philip Morris were right. They needed that live audience. They needed the electricity. They needed the immediate response to time the laughs. Bill and Vivian weren't happy. They were being used less and less because time was being given to the big time guest stars that were on every week. The first season, there were 5 of these, sponsored by the Ford Motor Company. The next season, Desi Arnaz got his own television series. I'll bet a lot of you didn't know that. The Desilu Playhouse, sponsored by Westinghouse. And among these weekly shows where Desi was the host, there'd be the occasional hour-long I Love Lucy show. This went on until April of 1960. Well, gee, Jeff, why did they stop in April of 1960? I guess I could make a joke and say so Bill Frawley could leave and do My Three Sons. No, unfortunately, for reasons I won't go into because why do you need to know? Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz decided that their marriage was over. So much so that they did not want to work together anymore. Now, as far as I know, they didn't hate each other. They didn't stop talking to each other. They didn't stop co-parenting their children. They just didn't want to be in a show and in a marriage together. Lucille Ball went off to do Wildcat on Broadway and to make movies with Bob Hope. Desi spent his full time running Desilu Studios. And Gary Allen, who was asking about Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, and the reason I put him off is Lucille Ball really had no plans to come back to television in a weekly series. Even then, she felt, we've done all we can do with the character. We'd be repeating ourselves. And in a way, she was right. But after Wildcat, and that's a discussion for another day also, huge hit financially, but didn't run because Miss Ball got very ill doing Wildcat. And it's during the run of Wildcat where her voice began to deepen. So instead of being way up here, it was getting way down here eventually. To your health. Doing a monologue is thirsty work. But Desilu Studios did not have as many shows on anymore. In fact, Desilu's sole purpose seemed to be renting out space to other production companies. It made them money, but they didn't own the shows, make the big money. And it was decided to bring Lucille Ball back to television so Desilu would have its own product on the air. They put it back on Monday nights where I Love Lucy had been. Lucille Ball would not do the show without Vivian Vance, so they wrote 2 new characters, Lucy Carmichael and Vivian Bagley. Desi was there as the producer. The original writers were there, minus Jess Oppenheimer. And for the first couple of seasons, the shows were really, truly funny. In some cases, matched the humor of I Love Lucy. In other cases, it wasn't quite as good, but it was very, very enjoyable. But the original writers and Miss Ball had a falling out after the second season. New writers were brought in who just did not understand how to write the shows, how to write for Lucille Ball. But strangely enough, the quality went, but the ratings went, I don't quite understand that to this day. So Miss Ball had no reason to bring in other creative people because the ratings were so good for her. 6 seasons of a Lucy show, and she sold Desilu Studios to Paramount or to Gulf and Western, the company that owned Paramount. They lived next door to one another in Hollywood. The two studios shared a common wall. The wall was knocked down, and now it was one great big studio. And Lucille Ball didn't have to run a studio anymore. She didn't fancy being the one in charge. She wanted to perform. She liked her arena. And the men she had to hire, 3 or 4 of them to replace Desi, talked her into what was probably a good idea. Let's not do sitcoms so much. Let's do some dramas. And Desilu put out Mannix, Mission Impossible, and Star Trek. So yes, it's Lucille Ball's money that gave us the Mission Impossible franchise and all of the Star Trek stuff. Miss Ball got about $8 million for selling Desilu personally. Had she held on to the studio and everything kept going the way it went, the Arnaz family would be billionaires now, just from Star Trek and from Mission Impossible. Oh, well, I don't think they have to worry about how to pay the rent. Wanting to have her own show, another Lucy series. Here's Lucy. That's the one where her own children, Lucy Arnaz and Desi Arnaz Jr., joined her. That really gave these 2 youngsters a chance to learn and to shine. And Gary Allen, that's the show. The highest rated episode of Here's Lucy, where Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor come in as guest stars. It is a fairly well-written show. Everybody in it is funny. Had the original production staff been there, it probably would have been funnier, but Bob and Madeline did write it. And Jerry Paris directed it, and Lucille and Jerry did not get along. So there was a little bit of tension on the set that week. Miss Ball continued to work until she got too sick to work in the late 80s, but with diminishing capacity and diminishing humor. The Lucy character needed brilliant writing to age it, the character. They were still writing Lucy Carter, the last of the half-hour shows, as if she was like in her late 30s or 40. People were still calling her young lady. It didn't fit. Lucille Ball was such a great beauty, but her great beauty was greatly enhanced by Irma Kusley's brilliant wigs that people didn't realize they were wigs, and the various makeup people, mostly Hal King, who put on extraordinarily heavy makeup to make her look younger. Well, maybe Miss Ball should have allowed the Lucy character to become middle-aged and elderly. The character never really did. The last series she did was Life with Lucy. So underwritten, the premise. She and Gail Gordon own a hardware store in Pasadena. Are you laughing yet, folks? But her grandchildren in the show were as if she were 50 and she was 70. In fact, she was past 75. I think maybe if they would have let the characters age naturally, I think Lucille Ball could have had a half-hour sitcom as long as she'd wanted one. But that's not how it turned out. Bob and Madeline stayed with her through the rest of her career until she was no longer doing episodic television. Bill Asher had walked away, and the people that replaced him through the years, some were great and some were mediocre. I wish I could say that she was wonderful always on television. I do believe she was wonderful always on radio. I do believe she was wonderful always in films, including Mame. I think she was wonderful in Mame. What's wrong with Mame is not Lucille Ball, some of the production stuff. But we're not talking about Mame. We're talking about Lucy and I Love Lucy and television. It's a shame that Miss Ball's television work from the late 70s through the 80s was mostly her appearing on Bob Hope TV specials, appearing on Password, and being interviewed about being an icon. I think she missed her work. I think she appreciated, however, that she was getting old, that she couldn't sing and dance and prance like she had. And as she said to me, I can't top myself. Well, she said it, but she tried to do it anyway, and it didn't work. So here we are, 70 years to the day after the very first I Love Lucy episode. Everybody still loves it. Everybody still watches it. I think the only drawback to I Love Lucy for some people is that it's in black and white. They have colorized some of the episodes. And I know the people who did it, and I love the people who did it. I have to say, I don't love the colors. We know what her hair looked like. We know what some of the colors of the dresses were. We have color photographs. I wish they had stuck to reality as opposed to try to give it a cartoony look. But I think if they would colorize I Love Lucy, all of it, they could stick that on television or on platforms anywhere. And I think the majority of people watching would still be watching Lucille Ball, Desi Arnaz, Vivian Vance, and William Frawley in I Love Lucy. I really believe that. That's how good and strong the shows are. They are timeless. They are wonderful because the people that worked on them are absolute magic. Gary Allen has just said to me, "What you are, one great storyteller. What a great show. Thank you." Well, considering I had no notice that I'd be doing this or that I'd be telling stories or doing anything today except interviewing Ruta Lee, I hope those of you who tuned in to see Ruta stayed. I hope those of you who stayed have enjoyed the show. I'm gonna end the show in a couple of minutes because, believe it or not, at 2:00 I have another show to do. But before I do that, please do indeed go out and buy the new Lucy book next year when it comes out. Please go see the new film about Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz playing the Ricardos. Go with an open mind. Go enjoy it. I think it's too easy to criticize. I think it's too easy to assume you know everything. Even someone who's done the research I have. You know, Desi Arnaz Jr. once wagged a finger at me. He said, "Geoffrey, you know so much, but you don't know everything. Keep an open mind." What wonderful, wonderful advice. I can tell you that Lucy Arnaz and Desi Jr. are brilliant, talented, nice, good people. That Lucy has been a wonderful friend to me. Desi has been a wonderful friend to me. The people who were part of the Arnaz Ball life seem to be wonderful folks. Whatever anybody's downsides are, they were loved. They continue to be loved. And although I have not based my entire career on one book or one set of relationships, I'd like to personally thank Lucille Ball, Desi Arnaz, Lucy Arnaz, Desi Arnaz Jr., Greg Oppenheimer, for giving me the opportunity to walk on the inside of all of this, to trust me with it. And I hope I've been a good shepherd of all the information. I guess that's why Desi Lu, TOO authorized my book. And I'm really glad that you all, through the years, the compliments you give me about it, people sleep with my book under their pillow still, floors me. It amazes me and it fills me with gratitude. I'm going to sign off a minute early just so I can change lanes and share some of these stories with somebody else. Gary, please feel better. Next week, we are having on a very different show, assuming that they show up. Two people who have been a part of the modeling and adult film world. They are enormously intelligent and have wonderful stories to tell. They are both friends of mine. They will be my guests next time here on Mainstreet. On behalf of Gary Allen, Gary, feel better. As I always say, God bless and have a happy.